and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, French President Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day visit to the U.S., where he is expected to take up foreign policy with U.S. President Donald Trump. Could the French leader persuade Donald Trump to stay the course with the Iran deal, trade and security? And in celebration of Space Day, China unveils plans to beef up its brigade of taikonauts, spacemen and women, who will run the country's own space station in 2 years. And will China join the bandwagon of booming space tourism ventures? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. A night of dinner and diplomacy, at least some diplomacy, for the American and French presidents. Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day state visit to the U.S., the first foreign leader to receive such an honor from Donald Trump. But behind the ceremony, there are deep divisions, many say. Before our discussion on those, take a look at this.
Of all the world leaders, President Macron is known to have one of the closest relationships with U.S. President Trump, and the U.S. President laid on a lavish welcome for the French President and his wife. Reciprocation after Trump was feted in Paris last July, guest of a Bastille Day military parade, a sunset dinner at the Eiffel Tower, but then there was that epic near 30-second handshake too. The French President has tried to bond with Trump while other leaders in Europe have kept their distance.
We're very, very happy and honored to be here with my wife Brigitte at the invitation of President Trump and Melania.
But what has President Macron got out of the relationship? Not very much, it seems. The US President unilaterally withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, a snub to French diplomacy and France's commitment to the environment. And as the visit gets underway, the US is just 3 weeks away from potentially pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Inked with France and other European powers plus China and Russia, this agreement limited Iran's nuclear activity and avoided a potential military clash. On the eve of his state visit, President Macron urged the US President to reconsider.
On nuclear, let's preserve this framework because it's better than a sort of North Korean type of situation.
For months, US diplomats have been pushing European allies to agree a side agreement with Iran, which would criticize Iran's behavior in the Middle East and address Tehran's ballistic missile program and other issues not covered by the agreement. But there is no guarantee the US President would even accept that. The White House says, don't expect a breakthrough on this trip. On Syria, France joined the US and the UK in the recent strikes against Syria in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack. But Trump says he wants to pull US troops out of Syria now that ISIL is largely defeated. On trade, the US has exempted temporarily the European Union from steel and aluminum tariffs. But the threat of US tariffs has created a hostile environment in Europe. Meanwhile, the US wants European help in pressuring China over market access and technology transfers. Macron has also domestic problems too. His popularity is plummeting in a France racked by strikes and resistance to unpopular reforms.
What can be achieved and what cannot during President Macron from France's trip to the United States? We are going to find out through our discussion with the 3 panelists. Here in Beijing, Wang Yiwei, who is the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at the Renmin University. Welcome, sir. In Paris, France, we are joined by Barthélemy Gourmand, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs. And joining us in Washington, D.C., Paulo von Schirach, who is the President of Global Policy Institute. Gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you. Let me begin with you, Mr. Gourmand. Obviously, the French President is trying to show his, shall I say, appreciation of his host by even stepping down from the plane and speaking English. As you may know, French presidents in history seldom speak English, even though they could do it. So, what does it say? Closer relationship, no matter what?
Well, this is not the first time that Emmanuel Macron addresses in English in a very important speech. Remember, for instance, his reaction after Donald Trump announced his wish to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change, And Emmanuel Macron made this video in English in which he urged the US president to change his position, and in which he also hoped for reaching an agreement with the American president. So this is some sort of a Macron style, you know, addressing important issues in English. Unlike his predecessors, this is a language that he can use very well, and therefore I'm not surprised personally that he did address in English as soon as he stepped in Washington, D.C.
Right.
On the other side, it is indeed a very important visit when it comes to the symbols, and this is one of them. The fact that the French president uses English to address the press as soon as he arrives in the United States is a very important symbol. This is, as you have mentioned in your program, the first state visit organized under the Trump presidency, and the fact that it is an honor for the French president is something extremely symbolic also.
All right. Well, it seems that the U.S. is trying to show something symbolic as well. Mr. Chirac, Mount Vernon is not everyone would go, right? It is where the George Washington actually have their residence there, and the dinner over there in Mount Vernon is quite interesting, isn't it? Some gesture as well.
Sure. Again, this is part of the choreography of this state visit, which again, as your previous guest indicated, is the very first state visit hosted by the Trump administration, and so it shows a ranking. It shows that Macron and France are very high on the list of preferred friends, if you wish, of the United States in Europe at this time. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, will come in a few days, and she will not get a state visit, and I'm sure people will notice that difference. So that aside, and indeed with all this pomp and circumstance, it remains to be seen what can actually be accomplished through these visits. The list of issues is very long.
Okay, let's begin with the Iran issue. After all of these diplomatic readings, Iran issue. The United States wants to withdraw, particularly President Trump didn't want to stay in the area for long. And yet the French, of course, want to play a bigger role in that region and probably even beyond. They would love to have a partnership like the United States. So, Mr. Chirac, do you see there's any possibility that the two sides could reach any agreement? After all, it seems that U.S. strategic goal has been switched from the region to somewhere else.
Well, it seems that if you look at what Mr. Trump said, both during his campaign and in his first year of presidency, and even just a few weeks ago, before the punitive strike against Assad, which was really confined to his illegitimate use of chemical weapons, the United States has no strategy for Syria, no interest in continuing a presence aimed at reaching not quite clear diplomatic objectives. The presence in Syria, we should not forget, was focused entirely on defeating the caliphate, ISIL. And that goal has been largely accomplished. The United States has very little leverage in Syria, with about 2,000 trainers who support mostly Kurds. And that is a problem in itself. So I don't really see America changing its course on Syria.
What about Iran? That was actually my question.
Oh, sorry. Iran is a different story altogether. In Iran, there is obviously an American sort of aggressive stance that the deal that was struck largely under the auspices and support of the Trump administration and negotiated mostly by then Secretary of State John Kerry, it's a bad deal. And America would like to modify it somehow and withdraw from it, etc. But President Macron has indicated that there is no plan B. What if we do away with this treaty, then what? Then it's free for all, and Iran is free from any constraints. There is no better deal on the table, and it is really hard to see what America would accomplish by withdrawing from the agreement as signed by the Obama administration.
Well, you would argue that there will be a lot to be seen that what U.S. States could gain from withdrawing for all kinds of treaties. That probably is only one of those agreements that we are talking about among many. Mr. Gouvernement, on the other hand, what will be the bottom line, you think, for France when it comes to the Iran issue? the role of the United States in the Iran issue?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, as it was said previously, there is no plan B, and Emmanuel Macron has been particularly clear on that. Yet, there are, of course, still several options on the table, and one of them is to try to convince Donald Trump of changing his opinion towards a nuclear deal. Another one could be to find some sort of compromise on another deal. Let's face it, this is not something that we can completely exclude, and we have seen in the past few weeks some change of attitudes totally regarding in particular the situation in Syria. I remind you that Donald Trump announced first that he was willing to withdraw its troops from Syria, and then he did participate to his operation a couple of weeks ago. So there are still some possibility to change attitude. The only problem in that particular case is the reaction of Iran. I mean, we know that if Donald Trump announces that the nuclear deal is over for the Americans, then the response from Tehran could be just reboosting this nuclear program. And this is, of course, something that would be simply leading to a catastrophe, to a disaster in the
If I could,
so Emmanuel Macron,
Mr. Gouvernement, what is the another deal that you are talking about? What is then the bottom line of so-called another deal? What exactly is the bottom line of France? And whether it is this deal or next deal or the one after the next, what is the bottom line?
This is exactly the whole question here. What is the possibility to find something that will make everybody satisfied? I mean, France and the United States are not the only countries that did sign the deal back in 2015. So we have to find, if we do change the deal, something acceptable for Tehran, something acceptable for Moscow, something acceptable for Beijing as well. And I think that Macron knows exactly that by reaching the US president in Washington, the, let's say, plan A is still to convince him not to touch anything and to keep the deal as it is, because yes, it is a good deal.
All right.
But on the other side, if it doesn't work, and if Trump is determined, we must find some common ground.
So I didn't get the exact word coming from you, Mr. Gouvernement, as to what exactly is the bottom line. You said it is still up there to be explored. Okay, let's go to Professor Wang here in Beijing. How do you see the division on the issue of Iran between the United States and France, or shall I say between the United States and some of the European counterparts, even NATO counterparts, about this? Is this going to be the division that is likely to define a very different outlook about diplomacy and about how the world should be run?
Definitely it's a serious test for for United States and the European Union. The nuclear deal made 2015, largely led by European Union, plus Germany, France, and UK. The Europeans seek more a multilateral approach and the diplomatic solutions to the hot issues. But the United States pay less attention to so-called the NPT, given that after the Iranian nuclear issues, they also have the North Korea nuclear issues. So the Europeans, I think about the NPT itself, about the proliferation itself. So U.S. is more thinking about the bilateral relations, they fail to themselves more unilaterally. So this is a serious dispute.
Do you think China will accept that if this Iran deal, which has been hard negotiated over the years, eventually fell off?
Of course, China, I think, share a very similar approach with the European countries. If no nuclear issues of Iran can be renegotiated, what about other issues? And then it's the chaos of the international order.
All right. Well, it is not the first time that President Trump is trying to challenge, quote, the international order. Having said that, though, Mr. Chirac, let me go to you about asking that bottom line. What do you think is the bottom line? Or Mr. President Trump is once again being a merchant, meaning he is trying to use it as a bargaining chip for something else?
Well, possibly. Again, this tactic may be there. I am not sure if it's going to yield success. We shall see, as the president likes to say. You know, we shall see what happens. Clearly, I mean, America has some legitimate concerns, because beyond the nuclear deal, there is the issue of the overall behavior of Iran in the region, which is highly destabilizing. Its interventions in Syria, its support for Hezbollah, its support for the insurrection in Yemen. All these are highly destabilizing activities conducted by the government in Tehran, which have nothing to do and are not covered by the nuclear deal. And then, of course, there's the issue of the development of ballistic missiles, which, again, are not covered by the nuclear deal. But America, if you recall, President Obama had sold the nuclear deal as one way to capture the Iranians and to modify their behavior, not just on nuclear proliferation, but on other areas as well. And that clearly didn't work. Now, has Mr. Trump a strategy whereby putting pressure on Iran on the nuclear deal, he can obtain other concessions in different areas? That would be fantastic.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if it's possible, because, again, that would require the cooperation of all the signatories of that deal, from China to Russia to the European Union, and, of course, France and Britain and Germany as well.
Yes.
That's very difficult.
Professor Wang, so are we going to see the United States challenge every piece of whether legislation, international agreement, or some kinds of historical achievements? If all these things renegotiated, what is the bottom line of the international order? Or actually, the U.S. is saying through this Iran deal that the U.S. is going to decide on the fate of everything, whether it's Iran or it's trade. We haven't even got a chance to talk about trade yet. We're going to go that. You'll see in a second. Professor Wang.
Definitely. Though not about the international security order, but also international economic order as well, like the WTO not works so well, and the U.S. want to increase the tariff in the steel and aluminum, and actually many European countries they seek the exemption from the U.S., but another due time is coming. So Macron also should persuade the United States that continue so-called the exempt and not to continue the tariff war against the European Union. And also the competitive with Germany under the leadership of the European integration. So this is a hard job for Macron.
If you could talk briefly, Mr. Gourmand, what is the bottom line and the principle of an alliance for France with the United States? Is it based on similar values of the world, or is it based on whatever the Americans say? Will this time, when the French president visiting the United States, be a moment to examine what exactly is the principle of this alliance from the French perspective?
Well, this is a very tricky question, especially at this
That's why I asked you, sir. You probably want to give me a direct answer.
We're just a few days. We're just a few days away from this intervention in Syria, and that question was actually raised here in France, whether the legitimacy of this attack was not to be questioned. And of course, the response from Emmanuel Macron was extremely clear, and this is the one I'm giving you now, although it's not particularly my answer. There was a legitimate action because of the values that we do share with our allies, the United States and the United Kingdom in that particular case.
Okay.
So yes, I believe that there is something strong here. But yet, just for you to know, this is a strong debate here in France about the so-called alignment to American values and American foreign policy. So this is indeed something that is not very easy to apprehend and very easy to answer.
Okay, there we go. Mr. Chirac, Mr. Gourmand said it's not easy to tackle. Probably for you it could be easier. What will be the nature of relationship between the European counterparts, France included, and the United States? This is not just about Iran issue, it's also about trade issue and some of the other strategic issues between the two sides. Mr. Chirac.
Absolutely. Well, look, if we look at the post-war period, the alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe was a cornerstone of the international political order, founded on the NATO alliance and a strong connection which gave rise to what people at the time were calling an Atlantic community. An Atlantic community of shared values and shared geopolitical perspective and a shared enemy, which at that time was the Soviet Union. Now, how do we redefine this extremely important relationship between the United States and Europe in the post-Cold War environment, where there is no longer a Soviet threat, at least as defined in the old days, and where there is a web of incredible, trade and economic and financial interest. After all, this is the most important bilateral economic, trade and financial relationship in the world. However, the relationship is frosty. The Europeans don't particularly like this style of American leadership. America does not trust Europe as a whole, as a partner on strategic issues in general, and certainly has all kinds of issues on trade. Now, can Macron be the spokesperson of Europe during this important high-profile state visit and try to pour some water into this fire of brewing trade concerns and misalignments?
Well, you know what, Mr. Chirac, when you are asking another question to my earlier question, let me tell you, it seems that earlier the Angela Merkel from Germany have already stated her position on many of the issues. That's why Germany and the United States, at least the current president, seem to not necessarily on a good term. So it is really about whether you want to have a good relationship, quote unquote, or the principle of the relationship, it seems. And I wondered, within the European continent, how would people look at what qualifies as the leadership of the EU, whether it is no principle alliance with the United States or is a principled alliance with the United States. That is certainly or going to be there for observation. Professor Wang, let me ask you, even though China is an outside player in this cross-Atlantic relationship, but Professor Wang, how is China going to read all these messages and informations when these two sides are trying to interacting with one another, whether it is trade, whether it's about world order?
Well, Chinese government now is pursuing so-called the Community of the Shared Future for Humankind. It goes beyond the traditional alliance system. The United States and the European Unions actually shared the values before, but now domestic values, international values, actually they are disputed. So this kind of the transatlantic community of the shared values and shared security concerns actually is being tested again and again.
Well, certainly we are going to see another day of negotiation and talk between the two sides, the French president and the U.S. president. We hope something will come out, and that would help us to solve all of the mysteries, gentlemen, as we earlier discussed. For now, I want to thank the three of you for sharing your insights and your perspective. We have Professor Wang Yiwei and Barthélemy Gourmand, as well as Paulo Wang Chirac. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it, gentlemen.